Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. David Deputy, who has, I found on the internet that he had 39 years of surveying experience, but he quickly corrected me, come on up, when he got here, that he has much more than 39 years of experience. So he brought a couple of visual aids for you to come up and take a look at when he's finished that he'll reference. And please don't hesitate to ask questions. We want to hear not only about the geographical changes during his career, we want to hear the stories. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. My name is David Deputy. I'm a land surveyor 3A class in Virginia and a property line surveyor in Maryland. I have been licensed in Maryland since 1982. I began working in surveying in 1975 in Oklahoma. Various twists and turns got me to King George in 1980 and 1990. I brought with me tonight a couple of different things. One of those is, as you go into Stafford County, the welcome sign in there has a note that says, "The boyhood home of George Washington." And I got curious, was it really? Well, if you look into history, King George County originally went from Gray's Creek, which is down in Leedstown, all the way to the Rapidan River up in Fauquier County. And I thought, well, that's odd, because it ran along the ridge in here. There's no real definition of what the boundary of King George was, but if you look at some adjoining counties in their definitions, you get that indication that it was along the ridge line in here. And looking at that, I thought, well, gee, Falmouth is between Gray's Creek and the Rapidan River. And if that was the case, well, when did it change? Well, the northern end of King George, up in that area, from the Rapidan River down to Deep Run, which is on 17, going out towards Warrenton. And it's several miles out there. It's out beyond the Geico building and all that out there. That whole area from there north was conveyed from King George. Well, King George actually was established in the Burgesses, House of Burgesses in Williamsburg in 1720, in November 1720. And then, let's see, in 1731, the north end of King George County, from the Rapidan River south to Deep Run, went over from King George to Prince William County. Fauquier was formed from Prince William County in, 1760. So the area from Deep Run to Muddy Creek, where our current boundary is, you think, well, that's the area where Falmouth is today. And you think, well, I must still been in King George County. Washington was born in 1732, and he moved to Ferry Farm in 1738. At that time, his father bought two different pieces of property up along the river in there, and he bought those properties in 1738 and moved up to the farm then. So if Washington was born in 1738, then when did Stafford County take over that portion of King George? Well, that happened in 1777. So it's clear that Stafford County was not the birthplace of George, it was not the boyhood home of George Washington. So anyway, that's what drove this map, and the basic changes in King George have been the county as we see it today. The southern portion from Brays Creek north up to Bristol Mine Run, that was conveyed to Westmoreland County, and the portion from Rosier Creek to the upper Machota Creek, which is up at Dahlgren, that portion of King George that portion of Westmoreland was conveyed to King George in that time. So, I mean, that's basically what this map shows, that Falmouth and Fredericksburg were both established at the same time because there have been so many people moving up to the north end, up to what was actually considered the frontier at that time. And they needed somewhere to have a house and have a trading center and where they could bring their products and go out into the market. So it was really hard for the people on the north side of the river, which is Stafford County, to get over to send their goods downriver out of Falmouth. So they are out of Fredericksburg. So what they did is they created two towns at the same time, Fredericksburg here and Falmouth over here. Well, Ferry Farm sits just below Falmouth. We all know where that is today. So I often wondered, I thought, yeah, it's a shame people don't pay attention to that. The way history changes over time, the south end of King George County, and from Leedstown up to Bristol Mine Run, Leedstown was a really small little place on the Rappahannock River. And in 1766, I believe it was, the Leedstown resolutions were drawn. These were the first, this is considered the first time when the colonies formally objected to the taxation by the king without representation. And the Leedstown resolutions are all proposed to be, Leedstown is proposed to be in Westmoreland County, when in fact, at the time it was done, it was all in King George County. So it's interesting to think of that in there. We've had, I enjoyed surveying in King George for a couple of reasons. One is, if you look at the history of King George County, where 301 today was basically the north-south route through the eastern portion of the county. And if you were in Annapolis, which is the capital of Maryland, and you wanted to go to King George, to the capital of Virginia, which was Williamsburg, there were only really two ways to get there. One was over land, or the other was to take a boat and go down the bay, up and then up the James River to Williamsburg Road. And you think, well, if they didn't go by boat, how did they get there? Well, they would come down out of Annapolis, they'd come down to Route 2 to Prince Frederick, Maryland, and across country from Prince Frederick, Maryland, over through where the La Plate area is today. Then they would cross the Potomac River at a place called Hose Ferry. Hose Ferry is about where the old 301 bridge sat. The approach to that portion of the bridge was about where the ferry boat itself, actually where the ferry landing was. And then if you went on down through 301, you got down to Fort Conway, which crossed into Caroline County. It's really interesting. A lot of this information you can garner through there's a website called Henning's Statutes. And Henning's Statutes is a compilation of the laws of Virginia from 1619 to about 1825. What happened is that each legislature would pass their own laws. And when this happened, there was no centralized place where you as an attorney could go look and see what the law was. Because once a law is passed, it doesn't get unpassed. It just kind of lays there. And unless the legislature actually goes in and says, no, this is not a law, it still is. So the laws, there was no single place that you could go, and there was a clerk, a fellow named Hennings, who worked for the Virginia legislature in the 1800s, early 1800s. He took it upon himself to collect these laws all into one place. And it goes from 1619, I say, up to about 1825. And these statutes are online. You can look them up. And I guess if you've got a laptop or a desktop, you can get a better thing on my mobile phone. I could not do a search, but you can do a Boolean search on that, or a name search on that. In 2000, and I think around 2008, I got a contract between King George and Westmoreland to survey the line between King George and Westmoreland. That area down in there was not a lot of definition as to where the line was. Nobody really knows. And there came some issues with jurisdictional issues about who has jurisdiction up in that area. If you called the Westmoreland Police Department, they would say, no, you're in King George, call them. And if you call King George, they said, nope, you're in Westmoreland, call the state police. Well, by the time the state police got there, whatever's going on had already happened. So the two counties got together. Actually, what drove it was there was a fellow right on the county line on Route 205. He had a piece of property. And for years and years and years, he paid his taxes in King George. Then, as he got older and his children got out of school, he paid his taxes in King George, so his kids went to King George. So as his kids got older, he got older, he went to the clerk of the court, or the treasurer, the commissioner of the revenue, rather, in Westmoreland, Mr. Beal down there, and they discussed it, and they decided that in fact his property was in Westmoreland, not in King George. So for a number of years, he would get a tax bill from King George. He would call Mr. Beal. Mr. Beal would call up here and talk to Mr. Perks, who was the commissioner of revenue. And they would hash it out. Nothing would get done. Man was pay his taxes in Westmoreland. Then Mr. Perks, we got a new commissioner of revenue. Mr. Perks left. Then Mr. Beal got old. He retired. So the new commissioner, they instituted a computer system. Computers don't talk. So what happened was he got a tax bill from Alice up here in King George. He was really upset, because not only did he get a tax bill for that year, got tax bill for back taxes for the past 20 years. And he says, wait a minute, I've been paying my taxes. I said, well, you're in King George. And he said, no, I'm not. That was one of the driving forces of why that contract was put out. And it got into the paper, what happened. The fellow went to the Fredericksburg Freelance Star, and he was really upset with this because they were threatening not only to charge him for the back taxes, but to sell his property, take it and sell it for back taxes because he hadn't paid. And the man was living on a fixed income. He didn't have the money. So I got the contract to survey that line. And we went down through there. It's a straight line from the head of Bristol Mine to Washington's Mill on Rosier's Creek. Well, there is no Washington's Mill on Rosier's Creek. And the head of Bristol Mine Run today, if you go down and look at it, you can see that it was obviously a headline of water further up because there's a deep gully in there, and you see evidence of the water in the ground. And along the line, right down on Route 3, right at the county line, there used to be a great big red oak tree in there. That red oak tree must have been 60 inches in diameter. It was a huge tree. And everybody in that area said, this is the county line tree. And so I went down there and we surveyed we set up GPS coordinate values on several monuments across the line. And in the record research, when you go down 205, and you get to Rosier's Creek, where Rosier's Creek today is not where it was in 1925. In 1925, the road, as we see it today, well, the road we see today didn't come until about 1955. But the road in 25 went down and went up to the left behind Bobby Washington's up to 218 and into the back around. When it crossed the creek, the highway department moved the creek because they didn't like where it crossed. So they moved it down to where the crossing is today. Well, when the highway department surveyors went through, they located on their survey map an old mill. Didn't say who it belonged to, but they located an old mill. And in the historical record research, I went back and I could go back into the late 1700s. Now, the county line was surveyed in 1776, I think it was. The county line was surveyed, and there's no record of that in King George County. No historical record of that, but there is in Westmoreland. There was a copy that I found digging around in the records there that I found. And what we were able to do was based on the centerline alignment of the road today. The centerline of the road in 1925, we were able to reestablish where the centerline was, and the surveyors had a picture of where this building was. Surveyors then surveyed just like we survey today, except we use a whole lot more sophisticated equipment. And if you're going down the road and the building's on the left-hand side of the road, that's where they showed it on their map. It wasn't over here, it was over here. So I figured out where it would be, and I scaled the position. And then I went to both boards of supervisors in King George and in Westmoreland, did a presentation as to what I had found, and they did an agreement to establish the line. Then we reset the line through that, across that line. But it was a unique survey at the time we did it.
So it's a gentleman in Westmoreland County or King George County?
Oh, he was in Westmoreland. Yeah, he was in Westmoreland. But there was a whole subdivision down there. Westmoreland got right upset with it because there was a subdivision. When you go down, across 205, on the first road to the right, you go up there, there's a subdivision up on the right-hand side. And that little subdivision was completely in Westmoreland. Westmoreland was getting the taxes on it. But when I found out, it was completely in King George County.
Oops.
And a lot of people were not happy with me because they now got taxed in King George, and the tax rates, the tax bases are a lot higher in King George. But it's where it was. I mean, I can't say it was any different. And so, there were 3 towns in King George County. One of those is Leedstown. Then there's Port Conway, and there was Falmouth. Port Conway is the only one I can find a map for. I could never find a map for Leedstown or for Falmouth, but both of those were supposed to have been originally laid out in survey. But this is a copy found Fort Conway down at the river. And it pretty much sets right on the southbound lane of 301 today. It was created in 1783. Francis Conway went down there. He owned the land. He was George James Madison's grandfather. He owned the land down there, and he decided he wanted a town so he could sell the lots and make money. And so he created the lots, laid them out, and then he decided, well, I really ought to go to the state legislature and get them to approve this, because that's how things got done. So after he had already sold lots in the town, he went and got the authorization to do what he'd done. It's easier to beg forgiveness than it is to ask permission a lot of times. But anyway, the only other plat I have here in particular I thought might be interesting is this is a copy of the courthouse up in King George County, up in the old courthouse. This survey map July the 4th, 1793 is when the property went from Townsend Day, or Robert Day, to trustees of King George County. That's when that piece of ground up in the county where we see it today, that's when it was created. And that was a copy of the survey map at that time, showing the courthouse and the road going through there. But the road that's on this map is not the road that we see today. The road, Route 3 that we see today, was put through there about 1937. Y'all have any questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have any idea how many plats you've signed in your career?
2 or 3. Several.
He asked him how many plats he thinks he signed in his career.
I have in my files, I had over 3,000 small plats that were 8.5 or 14. I had signed over 3,000 of those. And I probably had another 500 or 600 of larger maps that I'd done in this size down here. Anything else? Anybody else?
Question, we have Kings Highway today, Route 3 as it exists. Is that the original Kings Highway?
It was the original Kings Highway. The best I understand was that it was named not for King George, but for King Carter, Robert King Carter, because he owned property in Westmoreland County, but he also had a iron mine out in Germanna, and the road was built to get him from one place to the other.
Wasn't there a second Kings Highway?
It may have been. The alignment that we see today is the most recent one. The very most recent one was in the early 1990s. Then you step back to about 1955. There was an alignment.
King Charles originally established Kings Highway between Charleston, South Carolina, and Maine, basically called
That would have been up
Route
301.
17.
My understanding it was 17.
Yeah,
Route 17.
that would have been 17.
Number one,
Yeah, but 17 doesn't go through King George County.
No, but I'm thinking of the origin of the term Kings Highway. You don't understand that origin.
Oh, yeah.
You say that the Route 3 going by the courthouse, where was it originally? You said it's not where it is.
Oh, originally, the best I can understand, originally the courthouse was in, over off of Fort Conway Road, over in a place called Canning,
Yeah, over Miles Hastings. and that property.
over in that area, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I've never been able to find any. I've never been able to find any information on that, but that's what I was told it was.
So you've sold your company, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
When did you sell it?
2020.
2020. How many times do the owners call you and tell you somebody's looking for it?
Well, every once in a while.
I know it's me. So they have the same phone number because everything just crossed over.
Yeah.
And I think they, and I could tell by his voice. It was the only number I had. I had no idea it was the company. So when the man picked up the phone, I said, "Hi, I'd like to speak to Mr. Deputy," and you could just hear it. Well, he's not.
At least they didn't say I was dead.
No. I just thought it was funny. I imagine how many phone calls they've answered in the years since you sold it. Yep.
I got a question for you. This goes back to many conversations with Elizabeth Lee. She was convinced that there was a different road from Renee's property in Claydale to down past the old Alto plantation down towards Fort Conway, and there's like a trace of it back on the property way back that's on the other side of Oakwood Estate. And I remember a long time ago you told me a little bit of information about that.
Excuse me, I gotta sit down.
Mm-hmm. Oh, here. Let me just put this up here. I don't know why you thought you were going to stand up for 4 years. There you go.
Thank you.
So I was asking, do you know of anything about the road, that there was a different road?
What I believe to be the case is that the road, Dahlgren Road as we see it today, is pretty much where it's always been. It was in 1918 is when it was used. The bottom, when you go through down Dahlgren Road at Claydale, you go down a real deep bottom. That bottom was originally called the Pole Hill, because what they did is they had a cordon drove where they would lay trees down in the road so you could get down and get back up on the other side because it's so steep. What I think happened is Potts Lane, what we see today, goes back, and if you follow it, it goes down and it crosses the up end of, I believe it's the up end of Choke Creek. I'm not sure right off the top of my head. But it crosses a creek there, and it goes up, and I believe it comes out on what's now called Blue Jay Lane. I think that was the original cross. Mr. Charles Parker, who lived on 206, he was a long-time resident of King George there. And he told me as a young man, as a kid and a young man, him and his family would walk from their house, which was up almost at Eden Drive, down to where Potts Lane is today, then cross across there and go across to Union Bethel Baptist Church. That's where they went to church every Sunday morning. Now, he talked about how that him and his family would walk there every morning to go there. Or not every morning, but every Sunday when they went there. And I believe that's the road that Booth took. Because when Booth came in here in 1865, he crossed the Potomac River. And I believe he came into Gambo Creek and not all the way down into the upper Machoda Creek. He came into Gambo Creek and he came up, and there's a book I read that was written in, I think, 1939, was talking about this, said that he went down there and he tied up to a large walnut tree. And his assistant went over to Miss Cusenberry's house, which was about a mile away, And then by the time Miss Cusenberry's helpers got up to Booth, her brother had gotten there too. And Booth was carried from there up to Dr. Stewart's house up at Claydale. And Stewart wouldn't let him stay. Stewart realized who he was and what had happened. He had heard the news. Very few people had heard the news of the assassination by that time. And Stewart was afraid that if he got involved in that he would end up going to jail. So he would not let Booth stay. In fact, he made him stay in the I think it was in the chicken house. He made him stay overnight. And then when Booth came out, he went across the county and he stayed, or he didn't stay at Stewart's house, because Stewart wouldn't let him stay in the house. Told him he could stay in the chicken house, but he wouldn't let him stay in the house. So Booth got mad and he left. And he crossed the creek and he went on up there and he come across a fellow. I read the name, I can't remember it now. He come up to a cabin that was there. A man owned some property in there. And he ran him and his wife out. The man was an older black man. And they ran him out, and him and his wife, they ran out of the building. And Booth stayed there overnight. And then in the morning, he commandeered the man's son. And the son took him from there down to Fort Conway, where he crossed the river. William Rollins was a ferryboat operator at that time. And there was a fellow here in King George. His name was Ashby Strother. A lot of you will know him. He was William Rollins' grandson. And the story was that there was always a question about that, because after the war was over, William Rollins bought 5 separate farms in King George and Westmoreland. And they always wondered where he got so much money, because all he'd ever done is been a farmer and been a ferryboatman across the river. So there was always a question of, well, was he involved in it? There was no evidence of it. And what Ashby told me, or what, not Ashby Strode, Garnet Strode, what Garnet told me was that his grandmother got the reward for turning Booth in there. Now, I don't know how true any of that is, but it's the history that comes down through generations of passing things on. Are there any other questions?
Okay.
Yes.
So, have you had any seriously controversial issues with people who thought they owned a piece and somebody else owned the same piece? Or?
Not really. I try to stay away from that as much as I can. That was one of the reasons that I did so much record research on surveys, was so that I didn't have those kinds of controversies. If it went to the court, I wanted to be able to say, this is why I said this. And it may not be right, but this is why I said that.
And what about, have you come across anything, any interesting pieces of relics of any sort?
No, mostly the main thing I find out there, I ever found in the woods were cemeteries and graves. One of the things that you notice when you buy a piece of property and you buy title insurance, what you buy is a title searcher going to the courthouse and investigating the records that are on courthouse records. But their standard of care is 60 years to a general warranty deed. Well, 60 years is not that long ago. I mean, everybody in this room is over 60 years old. That means they're not even going, except for you. I mean, everybody here, I mean, it's one of those things that there's a lot of stuff that happened back in history. There are a lot of right-of-ways, and there are a lot of woodrows that were accesses to properties, lots and lots of properties in King George that were out in the middle of the woods. And there wasn't any way to get there except however those folks were getting there. Sometimes they were recorded, and sometimes they weren't. You know? Yes, sir.
Have you told your stories about Booth that you just telling to some of the people that were writing books, James Hall, John Stanton, Elizabeth Lee?
No.
That's history somebody needs to record.
Well, it's being recorded, yeah. Yep.
No, most people don't really care very much about history. This is a unique group that even cares, because most people just don't really care.
More.
Or they think they can find it online. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think they care enough to even look on them
Yeah.
personally.
We see some of that, and we've talked about that as a membership because we're not unique in that either. I mean, it's historical societies everywhere that are historic Port Royal. Their board members talk about the same thing, that it's it's a little scary, but it's just realistic that they have no idea what's going to become of it.
No.
You know, and like I was telling the sheriff earlier, the importance, to me at least, is to, at that minimum, protect what we have. And whether the society is intact and can do that or not, we have a museum that has a lot of King George history, and it has to be protected. And that's kind of their mindset too, down in Port Royal. So, and then I'm in touch with a couple of other societies. There's one in Delaware, there's one in Texas. It's the same thing. They're not younger people coming to kind of take the reins, and a lot of them are involved in manning their own museums and things like that. But you're right. I think a lot of tactics have been tried, and public relations and things like that. And it's unfortunate, but we're just going to do the best we can to protect what we have.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like I was saying, King George County was a crossroads. And a lot of people that you don't think about came through King George County. One of the books that I acquired over time was a copy of the journals of Mason and Dixon, fame for the boundary line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And Mason was a traveler. He would, every year, they would start their work in about March of every year, and they would survey until around the 1st of December when it got too cold to survey. And he would, from December, they would take from December to about the middle of January, and they would prepare all their documents for the Calverts and the Penns, and then they would, the rest of the year, they were off. Now, Dixon, Dixon was actually the surveyor of the crimes. Mason was really an astronomer. But Mason was a traveler. He would go around. One year I was reading in his journal about how after they had prepared the documents, they didn't have to be anywhere until March, when they had to go back and meet in Annapolis to get their instruction for the next year. So he was off, didn't have anything to do. So he went on a trip, and he went from Elkton, Maryland, is where their headquarters was. He went out to the frontier at Port Royal, at Front Royal. And then he came from Front Royal, he went over to Alexandria, then down to Colchester, which is just on the other side of the river, on the north side of the Occoquan River at Dumfries. And then he went down through Dumfries to Fredericksburg. And as you're reading this description, he's talking about his trip and where he went, through these little towns and all. And he says, when he got to Fredericksburg, he then says, I went from there to Port Royal. Well, he says, I went from there and I crossed the river into Port Royal, which means he had to come down to Port Conway, because that's the only place you could cross the river. Because he could have gone down Route 2, which today goes from Fredericksburg down to West Point, or down to Gloucester. And he talks about it, and I didn't really pay much attention to it. He says he went from, when he crossed the river, he stayed overnight in Port Royal. Then he went from Port Royal, he went south along what is today 17 down to Gloucester, then over to the metropolis of Virginia. Well, he was talking about Williamsburg at the time. And I was surprised the way he said it was the metropolis of Virginia. That was the biggest town in Virginia. And he said on the way back, he went back the same route he'd come, but when he got to Port Royal, he had to stay overnight there. And he decided, well, instead of going back to Fredericksburg and back up that way, he would go overland and he would cross the Potomac River at Ho's Ferry. And I had read that passage a dozen times, and it never really dawned on me. But that meant he came right through King George County. That's why I've always said King George County was the crossroads of the American colonies, because everybody coming south, you had a choice. If you went from Annapolis, you could go to Alexandria, or you could go down to Prince Frederick, Maryland, down over there is called Route 2, and then cross overland through Benedict, Maryland, and over towards La Plata, and you come down there. And if you go across up north on 301, there's a sign for a church that sits off to your left. You go back over there, and this church is a really old church. I can't even remember the name of it now, but my wife and I had been there, and his tombstones were really old. They were in the... I don't remember right now. It may be. And it's a brick church up on top of a real high bluff, and that was the way they came down through there. And when they would get down to, well, basically where Morgantown Generating Station is today, they would cross across on Ho's Ferry and come through King George. And I always thought, well, that's really neat, because Washington would come down through King George, down to the farm at Pope's Creek. And he would come down there, and they always said, I could never find a reference for it, but everybody always said he stayed overnight at the tavern at Office Hall. And if you go to Office Hall today, you have the sheets and the tractor supply place. Then down the road on the left-hand side, there's this brick building that sits there. And it's almost all falling down now. That was up where the intersection at 301 is today. And there was a big white house that used to sit up there. But it's an interesting place. I've always enjoyed working in King George, because, Westmoreland County was formed in 1652. What is 1652? It's 45 years from when Smith landed at Jamestown. That's a long time ago. The history in this part of the world is really interesting if you like history.
Where else have you surveyed?
Oh, I started my career in Oklahoma.
Oh, okay.
And that's a different lifestyle and different way to survey out there. Here we have what are called meets and bounds. The meets are the directions, like north 45 degrees east. The bounds are the things you go to from the Red Oak Tree to the stone at the corner. The bounds are the endpoints of the lines. The original 13 colonies, and that includes Kentucky, from Tennessee were meets and bounds states, because Virginia was really, really big. People don't understand that. If you're a surveyor in Kentucky and you have to go back far enough, you have to come back to Orange County, Virginia, to get the records, because that's where they're filed. It's like in King George. If you want to go back far enough in King George before 1775, you have to go to Richmond County, because Richmond County, King George came from Richmond County in there. And it's really interesting to see the derivations of the counties in Virginia. The Virginia Historical Society, years and years and years ago, I had a copy of it. They had like a flow chart table of the different counties, where the original county came from, and what was the original county, and then what this county came out of, and all that. And it's fascinating to see that, you know. And then where each county were, like King George went, part of King George went to Prince William County, then to Fauquier County, part of it went to Stafford County, part of it went to Westmoreland County, you know.
But that's a museum.
Yeah. Have you seen that online, Bob? Have you seen that online that he's describing? I feel like it's online.
You got a lot of stuff there, so.
Yeah. I mean, I think I came about it by accident, but I think I've seen that.
Yeah, because I had a fellow who worked for me, an older gentleman who worked for me one time. He was the one that gave it to me, and I had it taped up on there, because if you're doing record research and you get back far enough, you have to know where it was before, so you could know where to go look. You know, if you're in King George and you're over in the Dahlgren area, anything on the south side of the Machoda Creek, all the way over there, all of that was in Westmoreland. And I did a survey over in the area of Bethel Baptist Church, and in the record research there, I eventually ended up having to go to Westmoreland County to look that up to see what it was. And it was an interesting thing, because the guy was talking about how this piece of property was on the Frontier Road. It was up at the frontier up in there. And you have to think, gee, King George was the frontier? But yes, it was at one point in time. It's an interesting place. Yeah. Anybody got us other questions?
Well, your discussion has been absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
I agree.
I truly do appreciate that. Yeah, it always surprises me how many people don't care about history. And unfortunately, a lot of surveyors don't care about history in this same vein, but it's like anything.
Yeah.
You have good ones and you have bad ones. But it just always surprised me. If you sign a survey, how long is your survey going to be on record? And you think, well, I don't know, I have any idea. I worked on survey maps that were dated in the 1700s. Now, they're not real easy to follow, but...
What happens when a boundary changes? What happens to the previous maps that are now incorrect or whatever?
No, they stay there.
They're not,
They
okay.
don't get changed.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank God.
yeah. No, things don't...
What about, like you say, when the counties are merged like that or broken off, then, and people have to go to, say, Richmond County to find something that's previous to, when those things happened, they never duplicated records so that
No.
they could coexist? No? Okay.
No, there was no needing.
Right, right,
You had to know where to go.
right.
Do you ever run into much problem with this little piece of land and all of a sudden, all around it is owned and there's no way to get it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But they have to give you access back there.
Not necessarily.
You may have
Depends
to
on
go to
how-
court to get it.
No, not necessarily. It depends on how it got created. There's a piece of ground in King George over off Circle Loop that sets back up off the road. It was an estate in the early 1900s. The man died and he left his property to his children. He left a 7-acre lot to his daughter. And she lived up in Washington, D.C. She never did anything with it. But in about 1950 or so, and I'm not real sure of that date, but in a later day, she decided she was going to get some money, so she sold 3 acres of the property in the back. But she didn't retain a right to get there. She sold it, and she didn't retain a right.
People bought it and
Well, it got sold as a tax sale deed. Probably the man that owned it, his mother and father had bought it at a tax sale deed, had owned it for 25 years. They inherited it to him. He owned it for 3 or 4 years before he contacted me to survey it because he was going to sell it. And when I got looking at it, I thought, well, there's no access to this property. Now, you're right that you can go to court and get an access to a piece of property, but if that was created by someone and they forgot to give you access, the courts will grant you access. But if you own the property and you sell the piece in front out on the road and you retain the piece in the back and you don't retain access to it, you're not going to get access.
My grandma did that.
Huh.
My grandma did that, sold 2 acres from her 11 acres and landlocked the property that I inherited. I couldn't get right away. I couldn't give it to them. They surveyed it for me.
Yeah.
And could you go to court and sue?
If I'd gone to church,
No,
I got there, I pissed off in the neighborhood.
no, you can't go because the law will protect
The property
you
owner.
from me hurting you, but it will not protect me from being stupid. Because a deed is the language of the grantor, the seller.
Okay.
So if you don't mention it, you must have known it. You owned it.
They were good neighbors. They did it right away forever.
Yeah,
But
people didn't
right.
care. The use of right-of-ways is one of the most contentious things you'll see in today's world, is how do you get there from here? And if it's not obvious and people aren't using it, then there can be a lot of questions about that. Yeah.
South Carolina, you have to have right away.
Well, in today's world, the counties generally will not let you divide a piece of property, will not allow you to divide it without providing access to it some way in there.
So your zoning it helps protect.
Well, it's more the subdivision ordinances are set up that way. And the county governments are supposed to pay attention to that stuff, but they don't always do that. You know, the county governments don't always do what they're supposed to do.
And a piece of land right next to a piece of property that was split off and they moved Route 3 by 12 yards. You know, an acre sitting there dead, the neighbor that split off from, I ain't seen him. He got anything over it. Now, they proved they owned it. Now they'll sell it to me for $5,000. It's not worth it.
What are you going to do is across the street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's a piece of property like that on Ridge Road. There's Ridge Road, and there's a driveway back here, and this road in the middle, there's no property record on it. Apparently, the road, public road, used to go down here, and they moved it over here. And back up here, there was enough land to do something with. And down here, where the road circles and comes back, there was enough land to do. But this little piece right here, wasn't enough land, and it just sits there.
Now, what ends up happening, the highway department years and years ago would almost always, when they put a road down through there, they would take the land from the landowners. But if there was a little piece left over here that you didn't, that the highway department didn't need for their construction, they didn't care about it. They would leave it there now. They don't do that so much anymore. Anymore, what they'll do is if you go down Route 206, just before you get to Claydale, the old road, you can see it, winds out through the woods there, and these little chunks are on this side or that side, and it is common on Millbank Road. As you go across Millbank Road, right at the Guest property, when you go into Mount Ida, right there, Guest owned a little piece of ground on the opposite side because the road came down through it, but this little piece of ground was left over here. It got absorbed into a survey over here on this guy's property. And when it got absorbed, nobody said anything about it. The surveyor didn't catch it. And then they surveyed Mount Ida, and the guy who did it was from North Carolina or somewhere, came up here to do it. And they didn't do the necessary record research, and they didn't see that this little piece of ground still belonged to a guest in here. And this kind of stuff happens all the time.
Yeah, like I remember at Mark's farm when he bought it. There was a little sliver of road that went back to White Meat Packet. Went to the end down there to the Carter place.
Mm-hmm.
And they ended up buying it because the road had been put in. And here was the road.
Yeah,
But this still belonged to the highway or state or whoever owned the road. But it was just a little slice.
right.
And so they ended up just buying it and sticking it in there to finish everything off. I forgot about
That kind of stuff happens all the
all
time.
over the place, yeah.
People don't pay attention to what they own very seldom. And it makes sense in a way. You know where you live. You got your house, and you got your yard, and you got your garden area, and that's pretty much all you really care about. If you have a 10-acre tract, that's a bunch of woods out there in the back. And most people don't hunt on those woods because they're too close to the house, and they got neighbors, and all that type of stuff. So people just don't pay attention. One of the oddest things is people are not connected to land today as they were years and years ago. You know, somebody buys a house in 10 acres, nobody in here would ever walk that 10 acres of ground, or very seldom would they walk that 10 acres of ground. But before, you paid attention to it, you walked it, and you knew where it was. And it's interesting. One of the things that I could never get over was how I could go talk to some old farmer. He lived on a piece of ground. He probably lived there most of his life. He could take me out in the woods and walk me down through the woods out in the middle of nowhere and point out a pipe that was standing up there. Nothing there to indicate. There was no evidence that there was something there. There were no ribbons tied on it, no ribbons tied around the area, nothing there. He could walk over to it and say, "This is the corner." And when you survey it, you find out, yeah, it really is. Now, how the hell he could do that? It always amazed me how they could go out in the middle of the woods and see these things out here. But they could, because they were tied to the land a lot more than we are today.
My husband's like that, and he will do that. When we bought the Claydale property, that was the first thing he had to do. He had to go find it. And I thought it was funny that, and this is just a layperson not understanding how you decide that you're putting a pipe or a stake in the ground. Over years, it gets buried, and if you're not metal detecting, it's hard to find it unless you have some semblance of a plat or something you can kind of follow. But I always thought it was the strangest thing, because if I asked him about it, he would say, yeah, he would always talk about the pink ribbon or whatever. And I said, well, it's not going to be a pink ribbon there for long. That stuff just goes away. But
you'd be surprised.
I always wonder why. So I'm going to get to my what's probably a dumb question. When they put markers in the ground like that, why don't they put them out of the ground, like
Well,
a couple feet or something. So
Well, because it's inconvenient.
yeah,
You don't want to. You don't want to leave a. You don't want to leave a marker up in the ground like an iron stake or an iron pipe or something like that, where someone could step on it and
Yeah.
hurt their foot,
Yeah.
or you hit a lawnmower with it and bend the lawnmower
Yeah.
blade. But
It also was made so somebody couldn't see it conveniently and move it and put it
oh, I
somewhere
didn't
else.
think about that.
well, there's all kinds of. You're not supposed to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to.
Right.
Yeah.
But he's like that. He's always been like that. Wanted to know, wanted to know where his property was. And
Well,
stuff,
you don't have full enjoyment of your property until you know where it is.
Right.
And you don't know where it is till you get it surveyed. Anyway,
Yeah, he asked me if you were still doing it to bring you over to the property.
no, I quit.
I said, I think he's done with all that.
Yeah, I had some health issues in 2019, and I let my license go into inactive status in Virginia.
Yep.
And I retired in Maryland. I let my license go in Maryland probably in 2010 or so. Because it just wasn't worth it. I didn't know good enough work over there
Right.
to justify the cost.
Well, yeah, because as a surveyor, and you were surveying 20 acres of wood, you had to walk, right?
Oh, yeah.
You walked every day. Yeah, it's like you were saying, but my Uncle Ray, our home place in Luda, was almost 1,000 acres. He could have taken you, and it was up in the mighty wood. He could have taken you tree to tree, and taken you all the way he was born. And he was born and died in the same bedroom. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned about a piece of property and having access to it. Now, this didn't happen to me, but there was a survey company in Arlington that a fellow who had bought a piece of a 10-acre tract of land up on what's called Sugarloaf Mountain up in Loudoun County. It's just outside of Leesburg. He wanted to know, he'd gotten this 10 acres of ground, he had a deed for it, and explained where it was, meets and bounds and all of that. And he decided he was going to go cut wood on it. So he went up and started cutting wood, and after a couple of years he decided, well, I really ought to find out where this is so I don't cut wood on somebody else's land. He went to a company in Arlington, and they said, yeah, we can survey it, we can find it. And he said, okay. Well, they got to looking at it, and it was really difficult to find. So they put everything together right where the tax map said his property was, and they called him up and said, whatever you do, don't quit cutting wood. So don't cut any more. So whatever you own, it's not there. And he said, well, what do you mean it's not there? He said, well, it's not there. And he said, well, can you find it? And they said, yeah. And about 7 years later, they finally found it. It took them years and years of looking at deeds and records and all that. And they finally found it. And when they found it, it was in the middle of a 400-acre plot of land, property land that a farmer owned. This farmer owned the whole 400 acres, had a deed for it. Didn't mention anything about this 10-acre piece. And Woody said they went and surveyed it, and sure enough, they had to go to court to get access because they went to the farmer and says, we'd like to go survey this. Nope, you're not coming on my land to survey somebody else's property in the middle of mine. And they said, well, they went to court and they got the right to go survey it under the Court of Equity, I believe it is. Anyway, they went up there and they surveyed it. And sure enough, that's right where it was. They had all the calls for the monuments and the stone piles and the streams and all of that. Everything was right where it should be. And it came out to be like 9.9 acres of land. And the guy said, well, what do I do now? The surveyor said, we'll have to go to court. So they went to court, and the farmer, when he bought the 400 acres, he had it surveyed. There was nothing, there was no physical evidence that would tell you that there was something there. There was no fence lines or anything like that. in there. And he, surveyor had surveyed the whole 400 acres in this 10-acre piece right in the middle of it. And he went to court, and the survey had been, the man had gotten a survey done, had recorded it, so it had been on public record for 15 or 20 years. And the judge ruled, says, I'm sorry, but the farmer bought his land, he's paid his taxes on it, he got it surveyed, he did everything he should do as an owner. I'm sorry. And the guy said, well, what can I do? And the judge says, well, I don't know. You might want to talk to Loudoun County. So he went back to Loudoun County. They gave him a rebate on a portion of the taxes he'd been paying on this 10-acre lot. They gave him a rebate, but not all of it, just a rebate, not much. And he got a bill from the surveyor. At this time, the bill was $7,500. Now, the man did pay the bill, but...
What, had the other man with the 400 acres been paying on that 10 acres also?
Yeah, because the whole 10 acres, he had...
And they only rebated him part of it, they've been getting double paid for that.
Yeah, of course. The government will take your tax money, and they don't care who pays it. You can pay taxes on your neighbors probably if you want to. They'll gladly take
They
it.
were getting double paid on the same level.
Yeah, well, kind of the way
And
government
that one
works.
man didn't get hit, why?
That's crazy.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned meets and bounds being the system used in the colonies. What was the other system that was used more in the West?
It was the public land system. The public land system was actually designed by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's a unique fellow. His father was a surveyor. His father was named Peter Jefferson and surveyed part of the southern boundary of Virginia and North Carolina. But Thomas came in and as the president, he with the Louisiana Purchase, he doubled the size of the United States, and he realized you had to have some kind of a measured way to record the land. So they came up with a public land system, which is it's all cut up in squares. When you fly across the United States, you see all the checkerboards, and that's because it's the public lands. Every section is 640 acres, and it's a mile square in there. So, but the trouble with that is, as you go further north, the lines of longitude converge. So, as you go further north, the difference between the parallels gets smaller and smaller, so you have to accommodate for that as they go north, because all of it was set up north, south, east, west. And it's an interesting system. There's the public land system. Then when they divided the section up, it was easy. You just divided it in half, or you divided it in quarters, or quarter sections and things like that. So I mean, it was an interesting thing the way they did that.
I hate little house lots, 0.33 acres.
Well, if it's in a subdivision, you just reference it by the subdivision lot number, lot, block, and subdivision. That's the way you reference that stuff. But it's every piece of ground in the public land system can be described as a portion of the section. It can be the northeast quarter, or the north half, or northeast quarter. The northeast quarter is 160 acres. Then you can have the northeast quarter, which is up in the northeast corner, and it's a quarter of an acre. It's a quarter of a section. It's 40 acres. And then if you have the south half of the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter, then you can divide that 20 acres. You can define it. So I mean, you can define it pretty easily, and it's pretty straightforward. The public land system, that and the Great Wall of China, I think I've heard this said, are the only two man-made things that you can see from the moon. Because everything else you
Right.
cannot distinguish anything else.
But you can see those squares.
You can see the public landscapes, the squares on the public landscape.
I always thought it was amazing how they put such nice even fences.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Young kids now say it looks like Minecraft. When they look down from planes, they say it looks like a Minecraft game. That's what's in their mind when they see those squares like that.
Yeah, but that's a really fascinating subject to look at how the public landscapes were divided up. It all began at the Pennsylvania line, the western line of Pennsylvania and the Ohio River. Because from there, north and west, from there, everything north of the Ohio River and east of Pennsylvania is public lands. They're all what they call the Northwest Territory. That would be Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, all of those lands in there. That was all what they called the Northwest Territory in there.
Well, so but the states, we still have meets and bounds.
Yeah, Virginia and the original 13 colonies.
Still have that.
Now, when you go into Texas, Texas was an independent nation, but they have a different type of measurement in Texas and in Louisiana. Louisiana was French, so they have a different measurement there in the old times. They measured things in arpents. Yeah, and you'll see those references when you look at the Louisiana deeds, the old Louisiana deeds. Texas, they had what was called a var, and the var was a different length of measurement than the English used.
We have all that still working.
Hmm?
So all of those still apply in the country.
If you go back far enough in those deeds, yeah, you have to be able to make those conversions today. So
then the survey could get kind of complicated.
Okay, I got one question. I heard a term a couple of years ago. I lived off of Mount Moriah on Mount Moriah Church Road, and there was a property owner. He told me, he says, my property starts at the slave ditch, and worked around. And I said, what is a slave ditch? And he told me that all season that the plantation owners would have the slaves go out and follow the property line and dig a ditch so it could be easily recognized. I mean, did you run across that a lot?
All the time. There was one in Turkey Run, over off of Lambs Creek Church Road, back up in there, over by Bugos's Kennel, over in that area. There's a ditch, and this ditch runs up, down, and up and down across the hills. And I had heard about the slave ditches, and we located, myself and Motho, we located about 40 spots along this ditch. And to get a straight line, I just took the two endpoints and said, okay, if these are really in the center of the ditch, how are all the other pieces, other lines? And of those 40, one was off a foot.
Wow.
Well,
Everything else was within a foot of left or right of those 2 points. And you have to think, well, how did they do that? They go down the hills, and the fellow that was working with me at the time, he was also a surveyor. And he said, I wondered what this was. He says, it can't be a drainage ditch because it goes up the hill. So it can't be a drainage ditch, it's got to be something else. But they were slave ditches because, as you said, in the fall of the year, the plantation owners would bring in the surveyors. They would lay out the lines, and depending on who did it, sometimes it was the ditch bank, and sometimes it was the ditch. If you were doing it, it would be the ditch, and the bank would be over here on your property. If it was your neighbor, it would be ditch, and the bank would be over here. The boundary line may be depending on what the deeds say, as to whether it's a ditch or a ditch bank. In Westmoreland, I've run across, and in King George in one place, I've run across what they call the double ditch, where everybody, both people, dug ditches down through there. And in that case, it was just halfway between the two of them.
Oh,
Seemed like a reasonable conclusion to be halfway between them.
I had never heard that term, so that's why.
Yeah, they were slave ditches because, you know, the old adage, what is it? Idle hands are the devil's playplace. So, I mean, you didn't want people being lazy during the wintertime. You had to keep them moving, keep them working.
Jeez.
I mean, King George County was a slave-owning county. And you go back in the records, you see that throughout the county, all throughout the county. Was it wrong? It was what life was. You know? May not be correct to our sensibilities, but it's what life was. And the slave ditches, there's one. Let's see, this property. There's one over that way from here. Over about between Office Hall, which comes from 301 this way. There's a ditch in there that goes up across the hill and goes on over to the marsh over there.
Huh.
Yeah, it was not unusual at all.
I have a quick question, because I have to ask this, because I've looked in the Historical Society records, and my property was part of the Alto plantation, which
Yeah.
has, you know, Eaton State, you know, that whole area. How did that all get divided up? Because it has a very interesting history.
In Alto,
Yeah.
there's a survey map on what Alto's division looked like, what it originally looked like. It was owned by a man named Charles Mason. Charles Mason was imprisoned during the Civil War as being a Confederate spy. And they threw him into the federal prisons in Washington. Well, when he died, his property was divided up into, I think, 5 different tracts of land. And 5 different pieces. And there were several, most of them were several hundreds of acres. They were not just little tiny pieces. And,
Huh.
you're welcome. The Alto up there, the pond, I don't know if you live up near the pond, what they call Billingsley's Pond,
I live on Dawson's Landing, so that,
off of what?
Dawson's Landing.
Oh, okay, you live back up there. Well, where do you live back up Dawson's Landing Road?
Way back towards the swamp.
At the very last piece on the right, again?
No, that's, the one gentleman has 60 acres, he lives on, there's a couple up from there.
Oh, okay. I know
Because
where it is.
I've heard many different stories of how it was, but and I've also heard that the family that was enslaved on the property was then given ownership of it. And so I just wanted to know the actual, I've heard many stories, but to know if you knew how that land,
Yeah, there's a division map in the county courthouse
there is.
on what it originally looked like. Yeah, how the original farm was divided up.
Because I asked the thing about the road, because Elizabeth swore that road that you talked about, Booth, is on the back of that property. Because there is on the backside of mine, and now where Oakland State owns it, there is, you can see an old road. Like part of it's gone in the swamp, but you can see an actual road.
Yeah.
So Elizabeth used to think that it was joined up. It was the road that went to Potts Lane. That's why I asked that question.
Yeah, I think it was because Potts Lane goes down, you go down Potts Lane and it just comes to an end, stops. But if you look, it goes, the old road went on down through there. And Mr. Parker told me that we would come down and we'd walk down Potts Lane, cross the creek. You know, they forded across the creek and then went to church on Sundays. So, I mean, I've always thought that was a road that Booth would have traveled going through that area. I've never been able to find the name of the fellow. I was never able to find where he owned the property. Because they said it was his cabin, that doesn't necessarily mean that he owned it. Because he was a black man, he would have been a slave, may have been a free man, I don't know. But I couldn't find where he owned it, because I looked one time in the courthouse records and didn't see where he was a grantee owner.
Well, I can't thank you enough.
Oh,
That's
thank you.
fascinating. It is fascinating. It really is.